Recording.
I think you have to ask Ellie if that's okay with her. Is that okay with you?
It is fine.
Okay.
Is that okay with you, Kyril? You're happy to be recorded?
Yes, I am.
Great. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this hybrid seminar, CSOC seminar, fourth of the term, and my first experience of chairing a hybrid seminar. It's slightly more hybrid than we intended because one of our speakers, Kyril Drezov, has unfortunately slightly ill and so has stayed back in Keele, where he comes from, where he's based, rather than being able to join us in person as was originally intended. But hopefully that will not impinge in any way on the discussion. My name is Scheele. I'm a research associate here in CSOCs, and my expertise is more about the other side of the Danube in Romania, where the Romanians consider all the Bulgarians as Slav peasants. However, the sentiment is returned from the Bulgarian side of the river, since they consider the Romanians to be Latin dilettantes, and you know, there is, although they work together, there is a degree of the relationship. It's a complicated love-hate relationship, I think, across the river, complicated by old historic territorial arguments as well. We're meeting here tonight to talk about the latest Bulgarian elections. On the 14th of November, for the first time in the history of Bulgaria, we had parliamentary and presidential elections which took place at the same time, with the runoff last Sunday for the presidential elections. But as regards to parliamentary elections, these were the third parliamentary election within the space of about 10 months. The first one set being in April of this year, a second one in June, and a third in November. And what we're going to talk about tonight is why is what has happened, why we're in this situation, what the implications are now, because looking back, we now have 4 new parties, none of which were in Parliament before April, and one, the leading party, was not in Parliament until this third election. It didn't even exist before then. So it is quite you have to be an expert on Bulgaria in order to understand, and even more if you're going to have any attempt at predicting what's going to happen. We're very fortunate to have with us Gateva, who is based here in Oxford and is a lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations. She's been here in Oxford since July 2020. Previously, she held posts in Manchester University, Queen Mary London, University of York, and the University of Nottingham. And she is very much a political scientist looking at European Union politics, EU enlargement policy, democracy, and anti-corruption policies. And we've had the opportunity to hear her in this room on previous occasions. But of course, she's here tonight, particularly because she is Bulgarian. And joining us on screen, Kyril Drezov, who has joined Keele University in 1996. And he's founding member and co-chair of Keele's Southeast Europe unit. And he is an expert on Bulgarian, Macedonian, and Balkan politics. And if you listen to the World Service or read Oxford Analytica, you'll also find some of his contributions. So I think between the two of them, we hope tonight to come out with a clearer idea of why Bulgaria is in the situation it is and where it might or might not go. So we're going to organize this with each speaker having 2 bites at the cherry. Ellie, then Kyril, then Ellie, and then Kyril, after which we should have a good 40 minutes for a question and answer session. And I would encourage those who are not in the room, who are joining us on Zoom, to pose questions in the Q&A section, and we will attempt to answer these, and it'll be my job as chair to make sure you don't miss out by not being in the room. So, Ellie, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. So basically, the first thing that I would like to tell you a little bit more about is to have a look at some of the latest developments and compare the outcomes of the last 3 rounds of elections. Again, regular elections were scheduled to take place in April. Unfortunately, attempts to form a coalition government have failed, and this was the reason for a snap July elections. And even though there has been an important shift in terms of which became the new political force, again, futile attempts for negotiations have led to no government, and this was the reason why we ended up with 3 elections in the scope of 8 months, which it is a record definitely for Bulgaria. It has been a particularly volatile and unstable situation, and lack of political leadership has also had an impact on some of the biggest and the worst crises, especially dealing with the COVID emergency. So for those who are not familiar with the main parties in Bulgaria, this is just a brief outline, and I would like to talk a little bit more about some of the fluctuations which we have witnessed over the last 8 months. So basically in blue, we have the results of each of these parties in the April parliamentary elections. So we have GERB, they have been in power since more or less most of the time since 2009. And then also in April, they were the first political party securing more than 25% of the vote. We also had an important development in April. The second political party was to become There Is Such People, a party that has been launched by a Bulgarian TV presenter, or the Bulgarian equivalent of Jay Leno, and more or less they have managed to gain and also benefit from the wave of protests that have taken place and receive quite a lot of support, especially among younger voters. So this was the first new party to enter the parliament after the April elections. We also have the Bulgarian socialist parties that came third with 14.8% of the vote. Movement for Social Rights and Freedoms gained 10.4%. And we've also had 2 more new political parties. Democratic Bulgaria, although various formations have existed before that, this was the first time that they have joined forces as the coalition. And in April, they secured 3.9% of the vote. Here we have Hristo Ivanov, who used to be...
Sorry, 9.3.
9.3, is this not what I said? Sorry.
Yeah.
So 9.3 is what Democratic Bulgaria managed to secure. They have campaigned, or they have tried to raise awareness about the issue of the rule of law in Bulgaria, and this remains one of the highest priorities on their agenda. And we also had another protest party, Stand Up, Thugs Out, and they also managed to clear the 4% barrier in parliament. At 4.7, they managed to become one of the parties in Bulgarian parliament after the April elections. What we have seen is that there has been little agreement and opportunity to join forces and to essentially form an alliance between the so-called protest parties. So the new parties used to be also labeled as anti-status quo parties, and have very much received a lot of support on the way of protests that have been taking place in Bulgaria in 2020. So the second time around in July, what was perhaps the most important development is that There Is Such a People became the first political party after the elections. And they managed to overtake GERB. This was, I think that the polls at this point in time could not meaningfully predict which one was going to be the first political force. So we had There Is Such a People with 24.1%. A lot of hopes and expectations that they will be able this time, and we can also see that the percentages of the other new parties when it comes to Democratic Bulgaria and Stand Up Thugs Out also increase their share of votes. And nevertheless, they remain 9 seats short of a majority in parliament. So even though there were a lot of hopes and expectations that they will be able to hammer out a commitment and agree on a broad coalition, right from the beginning, There Is Such a People adopted a stance that they would like to have sole responsibilities, and that they would not accept, or they don't want to form a coalition government. They wanted to have a minority government with just 65 seats. And so in the Bulgarian parliament, you have 250 seats. So you get that with 65 seats, it's very difficult to have any meaningful minority government and support for your policies. So there were firm red lines that have been initially established between the so-called protest parties or anti-status parties and the status parties. So we have GERB, we have socialist and Bulgarian movements for rights and freedoms. And what we have seen over time that essentially some of the red lines have been perhaps weakened, and now there is an understanding that Socialist Party might be considered as a coalition partner by the new political parties in parliament. And this has important implications because if we consider support from the Socialist Party, there is a possibility to establish majority in parliament. And now what happens in November is what we have a new political party is going to join the new parties that have just gained seats in the last 2 elections in April and July. So we have the new political parties, which is called We Continue the Change. It was established by 2 ministers from the caretaker government in Bulgaria, and they have managed basically in the scope of 2 months set up some political structures and benefits from the mandate of a party that has been established before that, because otherwise you cannot register a party in less than 2 months. And so they have joined forces with both and use their registration to participate in the elections. And the polls before the elections in November were showing them at 15%. So that's why it was quite a surprise to see them gain 25.3% and put them in a position, so they become the surprise winner of the latest round of the parliamentary elections in Bulgaria. And again, of course, this has had an impact on the other so-called protest parties. Perhaps the biggest slump that we can see is what happens to There Is Such a People. So here from 24.1%, they go down to 9.4%. But this has also had an impact on Democratic Bulgaria. So their support has halved from 12.6 to 6.3. And then the Stand Up Thugs Out lost. They basically just got also half of their support at 2.3%. They could not clear the barrier, the 4% barrier, and they will not be sitting in the current Bulgarian parliament. So most of this fluctuation in terms of understanding these developments. Many would argue were not conceivable just more than 1 year ago. Before the protests that have taken place, there has been a summer and long-term protests across the country, but mainly in Sofia, that have boiled down to a lot of discontent when it comes to corruption and the rule of law and corrupt politicians, the way that the system is helping some politicians consolidate more power and benefit. A number of scandals have erupted involving using European funds and how they have been spent. So this is perhaps the reason why, I mean, I don't know, I hope that you can see. I wanted to include this in terms of reflection of the different percentages that we have in terms of whether and what are the possibilities for having any meaningful coalition. As I have mentioned before that, the anti-status quo, the protest parties in April did not have near to 50%. They've increased their vote share in July, which provided them with an opportunity to get close to 50%, but still under. And the whole time debates were that the Socialist Party will not be included in this debates for the formation of a coalition government. And in November, lines have been withdrawn. So currently we have 4 parties negotiating priorities for the establishment of a coalition government. So we continue the change, is leading the talks that are also taking place online. So not for the very first time, you can actually watch live the developments in Parliament. Their ticket has been to highlight transparency. And interestingly enough, not only for the very first time, we have a meaningful debate about policies and priorities rather than about dividing portfolios. But in order to overcome the stalemate in this political crisis, the agreement has been to focus on things we have in common rather than on red lines and what is dividing different parties. So we continue the change together with the Bulgarian Socialist Party, joined by there is such people and Democratic Bulgaria working together on hammering out a list of key priorities and policies with the aim of establishing a stable coalition government and reaching the coalition agreement that is signed before discussion about candidates and portfolios is debated. And just to give you this, just basically in terms of seats, how are the numbers and why does it matter? So we continue the change, have 67 seats. So together with Socialist, 26 seats, there is such people, 25 seats, and Democratic Bulgaria, 16 seats, have a possibility to establish a coalition government and have majority in parliament. Whether this is going to happen or not, we'll have to wait and see. But so far, there seems to be a lot of promising developments. Parties seem to have learned that it's important to compromise with the aim not to prolong stability. But interestingly enough, even though we have the Socialists at a 4th place, which was a particularly disappointing performance for what used to be the main opposition party, so we have, many have argued the Socialist Party and there is such people have an opportunity to be kingmakers, and there are a number of interesting and important questions. What are they going to ask for their support? There is such a people got a reputation for being unpredictable in terms of what their policy directions and positions are going to be like. So there is this uncertainty of whether they will be a more constructive partner. And of course, there are questions about what the socialists and their research people are going to ask for their support in return. And I think that this is here where I will stop and give the floor to Kyril, who will tell you a little bit more about the new political parties.
Over to you, Kyril.
Yes. Well, if you wonder why there has been such a proliferation of new parties in Bulgaria, you better look at this humorous take on former Prime Minister Borisov's understanding of the 3 elections. So once upon a time, Boyko Borisov, the leader of GERB the Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria, was also a new face, also a leader of a new party. But 12 years down the line, he is not. He's seen as part of a fossilized status quo, and the new parties have risen in protest to what is seen as Borisov's narcissism, the corruption of his party, and the general failure of Bulgaria to use the opportunities that the European Union funds offer for uplifting the country from its present rather sorry position in the European Union League. So this phase, of course, you might not have seen it often on British television, but there is hardly a day in Bulgaria that that people do not talk about Boyko Borisov. So his approach to politics was seen as quite unique in 2009. As I said, a fresh face, and he created a party that filled in a gap in the right-wing spectre of Bulgarian politics. So it's an interesting development that a person like Borisov successfully managed to aspire and to don the mantle of the leader of the right wing in Bulgaria. But there we are. The end result is that GERB failed to transform Bulgarian politics. It failed to turn into a normal party, a party that not only has due-paying members, but is seen to be working for Bulgaria's forward development. In 2021 is actually, I would say, in 2020, as Eli emphasized, with the mass protest against Borisov's governments, GERB's credentials were irredeemably spoiled. So the other main contender, traditional main contender in Bulgarian politics, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, was seen and is seen as equally fossilized, equally participating in graft, in corruption, and not having much to offer, especially to the young. Its leader is also seen as someone who is primarily focused on its own survival. So against the backdrop of these two traditional parties, as was the situation in 2020, we have the rise of the new parties in Bulgaria. Now, the rise of new parties is not just a Bulgarian phenomenon. It is, one can say, a pan-European phenomenon over the last 10, 15 years. And particularly, it has been particularly notable in the former communist world. Think of the pirates in the Czech Republic, in Czechia, but not just them. If one goes back to Bulgaria's own experience, in 2001, the former king of Bulgaria, Simeon Saxe-Coburg, established a party about 2 months before the elections, and this party won half of the votes and managed to form the next government. So what we see now with continuing the change, the party created just before the last election, is something quite similar. Also created 2 months before the elections, again relying on the charisma of, in this case, 2 leaders, and quite in terms of membership, it doesn't have membership. It relies on social media. So superficially, one can see a continuation of a similar trend. So let's look more closely at the trajectory of continuing the change and its leaders, Petkov and Vasiliev. So this party, Continuing the Change, was formed in late September, on 19th of September this year, by 2 Harvard-educated former ministers in the caretaker government. Arsen Vasiliev is on the left of the first picture, and Kyril Petkov is to the right. So the interesting thing is they gained their reputation by actually being in power. And this was quite an astute use of a quite typical Balkan phenomenon. Is people tend to vote for someone who has already been in power. So if these two individuals just created a party without having had a record in the government, they would have gotten nowhere. But once in power, once they gave a positive example, as seen by many in the public, they very quickly gained a fan base. Well before the creation of the party, there was a very popular Facebook group which was called Kyril for Prime Minister. And it had, if I remember correctly, 100,000 members. Their record in government was of absolutely paramount importance. Then in September, they became leaders of this new formation. And finally, they selected candidates for MPs and presented themselves to the public in the November elections and won a good share of the vote, as we know. So what are their policies? What are their advertised policies? Simplifying a great deal, one can say that they advocate right-wing policies, liberal policies in the liberal economic policies, but left-wing social policies. So as their leader, one of the co-leaders, Petkov, argued, we need wealth creation, but this wealth creation has to be used to uplift the people that are suffering in Bulgaria. So that was their distinct brand as far as policies go. Whether they will establish, whether they will go along the lines of traditional parties, whether they will eventually gain a membership, a due-paying membership that will solidify around the structure, we don't know. For the moment, they are riding the wave of popularity. They are relying on social media, and that's, again, very typical for these new parties. Political scientists are on two minds about new parties, especially in Eastern Europe. On one hand, new parties are seen as something that can run through fossilized social structures, fossilized governments, fossilized party systems. On the other hand, by disrupting the political system, some political scientists emphasize the danger to democracy, the danger to multi-party democracy that these parties represent. So the jury is, of course, still out as to how Petkov and Vasiliev and continuing the change would affect Bulgarian politics. For the moment, what we can say is that they have shaken the system. They have given a glamorous image of what a party leader can be in Bulgaria, and one has only one only has to look at Borisov or look at the leader of the Bulgarian Socialist Party to see what a contrast these two individuals offer. They're also a contrast to Trifonov, the leader of There Is Such a People, but for different reasons. Trifonov is someone who is seen as catering to like Bulgarians that look inside the country for inspiration, whilst Petkov and Vasiliev are seen as cosmopolitan Bulgarians, people who have made it internationally, and people who would at last join the country to the rich man's club. So that's their image, that's their standing at the moment. And depending on how things develop, they may win even greater successes. This will, of course, all depend on how the government formation would go in Bulgaria after the elections. They do not have much of a competition in the old parties. I have already spoken about GERB. and BSP. These parties are seen as stuck in the past. But Democratic Bulgaria, they partly competed for the same electorate, and Democratic Bulgaria in some ways suffered by the rise of continuing the change. So a bit of an ambivalent relationship there, one would say. The far right sector in Bulgaria has suffered a meltdown in the first two elections, but then a bit of a revival in the third election, with the coming to parliament of the party Revival, Возрождение, with 13 MPs. So that replaces the previous representation of what was called United Patriots, a coalition of three parties that was part of the government under Borisov, part of the very same government that was so severely criticized. They have effectively vanished electorally. So this is the political scene in Bulgaria at the moment, and we're having this big question mark, whether positive or negative, with continuing the change. This is the rising phenomenon in Bulgarian politics at the moment, and many hopes are focused on them, both for the party system, but more importantly for the country. And with this, I will end my bit and give the floor to Ellie again.
Okay, so just two quick comments on what Kyril was saying. I think it's important to also remind ourselves that perhaps 12 months ago, it was unthinkable that GERB will be in the position that they're currently in. A viable alternative to Borisov was not considered to be available at this point in time. So I think that this is perhaps one of the reasons why some have argued that the elections that took place in November were perhaps one of the most important elections ever to take place in Bulgaria. So in the scope of a very short period of time, there are many argue viable alternatives to what Borisov has presented as a prime minister. So we should not take that for granted. And obviously, clearly, there are now quite a lot of expectations whether they can deliver. But I mean, again, I think it's a seismic shift in terms of what the situation looked like 12 months ago. And as Kyril rightly mentioned, it's not the first time that a new party has come and won outright the elections, whether we think about the former king, or whether we think about Borisov, how he burst on the scene, whether we think about Trifonov in the form of various such people. And now we have, the question is, I mean, again, new messiahs on the scene. Can they deliver a lot of expectations and hope? And that some have argued that they represent perhaps the revival of politics and a new political class. And we will have to wait and see whether they can deliver on some of their promises. Why I think there is quite a lot that there is at stake. I mean, clearly the COVID crisis has had a huge impact on Bulgaria, and there is just the next slide that I want to show you. I mean, one of the things that has suffered is that we have seen basically a very heavy death toll that has been taking place. Unfortunately, this is a reflection of the data for the period of last 14 days, of what is the number of deaths per 1 million of the population. And unfortunately, it is very, very, very tall. And if you have a more global perspective and you look at death toll per million per population since the beginning of the crisis, Bulgaria is in second place in the world. And in addition to that, it is one of the countries which has the lowest, well, definitely in the EU, vaccination campaign has not been particularly successful, to put it mildly. And currently, we continue to have still less than 30% of the population. Many have argued that precisely because there has been no political leadership and clear political winner. Political leaders have been reluctant to engage with this topic, to openly advocate or to promote vaccinations. So this is, I mean, again, clearly one of the most urgent issues that the new government will need to deal with, because it has a range of implications on the health system.
So Microphone.
on the health system as well as on the economy. So I think that this is perhaps one of the most important and urgent government needs to address. There are other very strong and important issues, the broader context about the rule of law reform and ensuring that there is a much more meaningful fight against corruption. This is also one of the key aims of some of the main priorities. We have numerous reports that have raised concerns about political and economic power, how power has been concentrated, about abuse of power and lack of accountability. And I think the fact that freedom of media has basically collapsed in Bulgaria and is clearly currently ranked 112th place in the world is something that perhaps has not received a lot of attention, but it has a very poor record when it comes to freedom of media. This is another big challenge. And if we talk about other issues in broader European context, environment and transition to a green economy is also another particularly sensitive issue. There have been debates that started to 2040 is the target date that has been set up for net zero, which many argue is not particularly ambitious. And it has the chance to polarize and to raise a number of important questions. And this is before we touch on the area of economic and social inequality, which will require significant and meaningful efforts. What we Continue Change, have pledged that they will have zero corruption, free of resources, and work and address some of those key priorities with a focus on making businesses competitive and also enhancing the quality of education and building a better economy. So clearly there is quite a lot in terms of domestic agenda to be addressed and dealt with. And this is before we even turn to external relations and the position that Bulgaria has had in terms of broader developments when it comes to an EU enlargement process. And here I will give the floor to Kyril again to reflect on the foreign policy dimension and implications that we have in place.
Just before Kyril starts speaking, could I remind those on Zoom that if you have questions, you should put them in the Q&A part of the screen. You should find a Q&A button to press rather than in the chat. I picked up one question in the chat, which I will take, but you should, it's helpful to the chair if you can raise them in the Q&A rather than in the chat. Kyril.
Right, the foreign policy dimension of the elections. I think here is a good time to introduce another election, which is the presidential election. Just very briefly, the presidential election did not offer big surprises. It went into 2 rounds. It nearly went into 1 round because the incumbent, President Radev, won the first round with 49.5%. Thereabouts, but it went into 2 rounds, and then it was around 65 to 35, so 2 to 1 roughly, and this is exactly what the opinion polls were predicting. So the president is important in several ways. From 2020, from the summer of 2020, when the protest movement erupted in Bulgaria, the president was in effective confrontation with Prime Minister Borisov. The President Radev was seen as supporting the protesters. Actually, the protesters also supported him because he was in confrontation with the chief prosecutor, a much maligned figure in Bulgaria, and a much maligned institution, the prosecution in Bulgaria. But we can discuss this more in the question time. So Borisov and Radev were seen to be confronting each other, all-consuming confrontation. Radev was the person that actually appoints the caretaker governments, and he is the person who selected the two attractive Harvard graduates, the ministers of finance and minister of the economy, Petkov and Vasilyev, who went on to create this successful political project continuing the change. So the president has been important in all that. Another thing that was very involved in this confrontation between president and prime minister when Borisov was prime minister and then leader of GERB was the foreign policy dimension. It was not that important in the internal party squabbles in Bulgaria, but as far as the president goes, it became all important. So GERB and Borisov tried to mobilize the electorate against Radev, depicting him, they would not even call him the president, they would call him the resident, meaning a Russian resident, Putin's resident in Bulgaria. So Radev was depicted as Putin's puppet and someone who had supported the annexation of Crimea by Russia. And he actually, in the one and only presidential debate, he made a rather unfortunate remark, which seemed to confirm that. So, whatever many in Bulgaria think about the foreign policy wisdom of Radev, they give priority to internal politics. So the foreign policy dimension is important, but primarily the three elections that we discussed were about internal issues. And Russia is far more of a bogey in Bulgarian politics than an all-important factor. Now, concerning another issue that flared up in the both presidential election and the other parliamentary elections is the issue of relations with Macedonia. Again, it's long and complex, and I'll leave it for the questions time, but just to say that over the last year and a half, Bulgaria has been effectively blocking the start of EU negotiations of Macedonia. The reason for that are long and complex, and we can discuss them further. But the important thing to emphasize is that there isn't much of a difference. There wasn't much of a difference between the two presidential candidates, the one supported by GERB on the right of the slide, Professor Gergikov, and the one on the left, who is the incumbent, Radev. Both of them supported what can be briefly described as a tough line concerning Macedonia's EU ambitions. This is as far as Macedonia goes. Another issue that has flared up in the presidential election, far more than in the parliamentary elections, apart from the very last one, was Turkey and the relationship between Turkey and the movement for rights and freedoms. Basically, what became controversial is that the movement for rights and freedoms, with the support of the Turkish state, and managed to organize a superb mobilization of its electorate in Turkey. There was mass voting, which increased their share of the vote of the movement for rights and freedoms. And by some calculations, every third MP of the movement of rights and freedoms has been elected in Turkey. This led to a protest declaration, protest note by the Bulgarian government addressed to the Turkish government. Then the Turkish government also called the Bulgarian ambassador. Some sharp words were exchanged, but after Radev's win, both sides have taken a step back, and it seems that they do not want to these exchanges to continue. In short, the movement for rights and freedoms supported GERB's candidate, Professor Gergikov, on the right, but without much enthusiasm and without anything approaching the mobilization they managed to organize for the third presidential election. So the choice between a former Air Force general, that is Radev, or the professor of Latin, that is Gergikov, the candidate of GERB, has been decided with 2-to-1 majority in favor of, in favor of the former Air Force General. And with this, I will conclude, and I hope that we'll have plenty of time to discuss some of the issues that were hinted at in our presentations in the questions and answer session.
Thank you very much indeed, Kyril. And I'm usually, we have now about 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, 40 minutes for question and answer, if we have enough. I'm going to begin with a couple of questions